We have had a fantastic day so far, though some people have been up for a very long time, whereas other people, it's 4 in the morning. So it is very much one of those good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, all at the same time kind of deals. So what we are going to be doing is first having Stephen provide us with some opening remarks. So I'll just do a very, very brief intro to Stephen, because it is absolutely my pleasure to get to introduce him. So Stephen Webb is, he's going to also be returning towards the end of the block to offer some concluding remarks and reflections on the conference as a whole, which is lovely. So Stephen is currently a professor of social work at Glasgow Caledonian University in Scotland, where he is also assistant vice principal for community and public engagement. He has held a number of teaching positions in the UK and Australia, as well as visiting professorships in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Portugal, and in Lithuania. He's also an extremely prolific writer and these days also editor, having contributed some of the most highly and regularly cited work in academic social work. But outside of those sorts of fancy professional things, he is also a lovely, lovely cat dad, if you didn't know that about Stephen Webb. And we might be lucky enough actually to see some of his Furbies wander around while he's doing his thing generously and lovely and as the ways that he always is. So Stephen, I'm going to pass it over to you, and you have about 10 minutes maximum, and then I will cut you off and we will move to the paper presentations if that sounds okay.
Okay, thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from sunny south side Glasgow. I thought I'd give you a feel for some of the ideas and thoughts and approaches that have gone on before, particularly in the previous session. As you probably know, Walter Lorenz was the keynote speaker, and he was talking very passionately and convincingly about what the future of social work might look like in a post-COVID climate or context. And a lot of the themes that he raised, interestingly enough, started to resonate with the various papers that followed. Now, I won't summarize each of the papers because I don't think that will do them proper justice, but what I will do, just to kind of help give you a sense of what were the occurring and emerging themes, I'll give you 4 or 5 key themes that stood out for me, and I think for other people as well. I noticed that Donna Peach and Joel Islar are still here from the previous session. So if Donna or Joel would like to come in and comment or add anything along the way, I'd be very happy for them to do that. So I'm going to go through 4 or 5 themes, and maybe this will also help set the tone for some of the presentations and some of the foci that are likely to come up in this evening session for us. The first theme I wanted to draw attention to was the power of interdisciplinarity. And I described the previous session as interdisciplinarity in motion. And what was really quite telling for me was the way that different presenters had trawled and reached out to different disciplinary places such as anthropology, political philosophy, political science, sociology, cultural geography, and so on and so forth, and really showed social work up to be really quite versatile and quite mobile around the way it could incorporate, accommodate, reframe, and encapsulate different disciplinary ideas. And it made me actually wonder whether social work is pretty well placed and mobile enough to do that kind of interdisciplinary work in a way that some other subjects who are kind of captured in echo type spaces are unable to do. So for me, it best begged a question not only about the power of disciplinarity, but the particular position and opportunities that social work is afforded by being able to make these kinds of disciplinary moves. The second big theme that that popped up for me was potentially a more challenging and more difficult one, and that was around this question of the political and what we understand by the political in social work. And there were several, probably many more cases where people were talking about power, they were talking about authority, they were talking about resistance, they were talking about state apparatus, and the way that social work is positioned at different intersections and entangled with different sort of power relations and power regimes. And my own recent work has been focusing on the kinds of rich opportunities that European political philosophy offer for social work thinking, with a special emphasis on something that's called biopolitics. And some of the more recent work that I've been doing, I'm currently preparing a new Routledge handbook for critical social work. But some of the more recent work I've been doing has focused on this notion of agonistics of power, the way that power, the way that relationships are always held in a kind of fluid and dynamic and often temporal relationship of power, although other relations of power are more fixed and static. And you might think of capitalism as one of those. So the political and the different thinking around the political in terms of resistance and domination, and of course oppression and exploitation were central ideas that marked the previous session. And I think that led to the kind of third theme that I was intrigued and thinking about, and that is, what is the relationship between critical social work and mainstream social work? And that kind of relationship, which has never been fully unpacked or fully thought through, I think stood pretty central to a lot of the concerns that people were raising in that previous session. And of course, that begs the question about, if you position yourself as a critical social worker, what kind of ethical or moral requirement does that make on you in addressing mainstream social work? So some of the comments in different papers in the previous session were hugely critical of mainstream social work, and one presenter actually described it as boring and ineffective, and suggested that it didn't fulfill the ambitions of social workers as they came into their career or the profession, and it was often a huge disappointment to them. So this question about the relationship between critical social work and mainstream social work, I think, is one that we need to, if we see this as an important relationship, is one that we need to try and unpack further. The fourth theme that drew my attention was around alternative types of social work, and this links obviously directly to the question of what is the future of social work. And there seemed to be some kind of consensus that the future of social work had to have the concept of community sitting pretty central to the kinds of alternatives and ideas that were envisaged, and community social work seemed to be a preferred choice. And one of the things that I wanted to suggest there was that if community social work is something that we want to endorse and support, then that raises questions about mainstream social work again, because it's not likely to look very much like what the orthodox or the mainstream social work currently looks like, particularly in the European context, I think. I've worked in Australia as well, so I know what the similarities and differences are between Australian and European social work. But this idea that community social work might be a way forward, Walter Lorenz suggested that if that is to be the case, then it while it's important that it happens from the ground up, that people need to reach further afield and try and establish international alliances and international partnerships, because if there is a paradigm shift that's available to us, and maybe the paradigm shift in social work, if it's one that we think is necessary, actually starts in social work education as well as in social work communities. That we need to actually think more carefully about what we mean by community. One of the things that I wanted to push was this idea that community is a contestable concept, particularly in political philosophy and social sciences these days. There are some views that community is transitory, it's temporary, and it attaches itself to issues and objects of vested interest, and that it's not something that's settled or foundational in any kind of obvious empirical way. So if community social work is something that we think is important, what we mean by community and what we mean by community social work needs to be thought through fairly carefully. The last point I want to make, Tina, just before we move on to the one and only Verena Fisch, is that the inevitability of thinking about COVID and what the post-COVID world will look like for social work was also something that preoccupied people. And I don't think as social work practitioners, policymakers or academics, we've properly grasped what that means to us. A lot of political scientists are talking about what they call the religion of health these days, and how public health has become increasingly a dominant force, and what that means for social work. I mean, does it mean, for example, that we're likely to experience a hardening of a particular view of science, and a move away from a kind of more relational and a kind of more intrinsically involved, connected set of relationships? Does it mean that there'll be the emergence of a kind of hardening of digital technologies and so on and so forth? And will social work be hanging on to the coattails of public health if public health occupies some kind of dominant and pristine position in a post-COVID world? So there was a lot of discussion and debate about what the post-COVID social work might look like, and I think we're all searching in the dark a little bit for how that might eventually turn out to be. So they were the 5 or 6 key thoughts and moments and themes that I took from this afternoon's session, and I look forward to hearing what you guys have got to say this evening. And I've got a bottle of wine here to help me through, so I'm sure I'll be okay. So I'm going to hand over to Tina, who's going to introduce you to the remarkable Verena Fisch. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was awesome. Yeah, so we are now heading into paper session number 4. And so we have 3 papers. They're headed up by Verena, is going to go first. Then we're going to have Zean, Tara, Danielle, and Kimberly. And then Blake is going to be our 3rd and final paper for paper session 4. Each paper is going to have about 15 minutes to give their talk or give their presentation, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for discussion at the end of that, and then we're going to head to just a brief break before we come back for the next paper session. So I just need to get my recording set up. Okay. Yay! Thank you, Verena, for starting that off.
Hello. No pressure.
Yeah. Can you share your screen?
Yes, that's what I'm going to do just now. Okay. What do you see?
I see your full PowerPoint deck, including the slides on the left-hand side.
And now?
I see presenter notes, as well as the larger slide.
I'm just going to switch that. What about now?
And they're beautiful. You are good to go.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, my name is Verena. I'm currently studying a Master of Research at GCU. And I will be hopefully starting my PhD in October. So my presentation is going to touch on a lot of the themes that came up during this conference today, especially in our first paper session, and definitely a lot of things that Stephen just mentioned are going to pop up again. I will, as many before me today, argue that we need a social work that centers communities instead of individuals as its main unit of analysis and intervention. And then the question, as Stephen said, is who is included in this community? And I would say that these communities that social work has to engage with are inevitably made up of human, but also more than human beings alike. So the question is then, how can we understand community beyond the present anthropocentric perspective to reflect the multi-species communities that we as humans are always embedded in? And I choose community gardens as spaces where relationships between people, but also between human and non-human beings, become particularly concrete and tangible. I will use interviews that I conducted with social workers last year as a guide through my presentation today. So I will take a very inductive approach in kind of centering community gardens as a real life example and as a sort of entry point into conceptualizing community in a way that is useful for an ecologically conscious community social work. So I will attempt to show how garden communities can teach us how to combat the individualism that we see in social work today and support us in broadening social work's understanding of the community and solidarity. So as I just mentioned, this contribution is heavily based on 5 semi-structured interviews that were conducted last year online as part of my MSc dissertation. All participants were qualified social workers with personal and professional experience in working with community gardens or therapeutic gardening. And while the main focus of my dissertation was actually on social work and political ecology, the questions and remarks about garden communities or forms of communities in gardens, oh, sorry, that was too fast, as well as questions about community social work, actually were mentioned in every interview. So I figured that that is actually a very important aspect to focus on. And just very briefly, when I talk about community gardens, I really include all sorts of gardens. So I use a very loose definition in this sense. The gardens could vary in their sizes, in the design, in their gardening styles. They can grow vegetables or flowers or both. They could be attached to a school, for example, or to hospitals, or they could be meeting spaces in a neighborhood. So all of that is kind of included when I talk about community gardens. But before we talk about gardens, actually, let me just spend one moment on some quotes that I took from the interviews that I mentioned about how social workers described the status quo of social work today, specifically in the United Kingdom. So participants described their work as very task-focused, as very much process-driven, as a form of production line. And they stated that to really sit with someone and to really support people and working with people, not just delivering for them, is very difficult. They saw social work as a profession that delivers services to passive consumers and has a very authoritarian approach. Instead of kind of helping people and supporting people, some actually felt like they were punishing people. With regards to the modern human environment, one participant stated that understanding, the social work's understanding is very hierarchical. So the social work sees humans as the most important things, as the top of the chain, and as very much disconnected from other living beings. And I think this is something that we have heard today again and again. It's just another yeah, another voice in this whole conversation. Yeah, so these statements express very well the social work's focus on the human individual. So individuals form the standard unit of intervention, whereas the more than human beings are entirely left out of the equation. And I would argue that this human exceptionalism combined with this individualism of very neoliberal forms of governance systematically undermine social and ecological justice, and they negate the embedded nature of all life, and then consequently lead to fragmentation of knowledge, of solidarity, and responsibility. As Karen Bell also argued today, neither can such assumptions adequately represent the social work profession, nor are they any helpful in envisioning strategies for transformative change. So when we compare this to participants' experience in community gardens, we see a very different picture, actually. So participants described, for example, the health aspects of gardening and engaging with other people in green spaces, the benefits of growing food locally, as well as attempts of keeping the spirit of the commons alive and the importance to reclaim outdoor spaces for society. So these relationships and interactions between people in these gardens are also what most research about community gardens concentrates on. Conventionally, the term community garden describes gardens as a space that brings people from various professional and ethnic backgrounds together in their shared quest to grow their own food or to make the neighborhood a bit greener. From an anthropocentric perspective, gardens then grow in this intersection between food politics, between urban planning, social movements, social work, social action, and they offer an entry point into bigger political debates. As Claire Nettle found, for example, gardens are places where people come together to tackle challenges of transnational scope at the most local level. So what I want to focus in this presentation is, however, the inclusion of non-human beings, of more than human actors into social work's conceptualization of community. So when asked about the relationships gardeners had with plants and animals in their gardens, participants talked about how people forge these connections almost organically as they are nurturing and growing things. This is obviously not to say that all relationships between gardeners and non-human beings are always positive. I'm a gardener myself, and I definitely can think of some examples where species are marked as pests or labeled as weeds. However, the gardeners get attached to the plants they grow. They form relationships with other people, but also with animals. And in doing so, they kind of contest the fine lines of who is included in a community and who belongs to a particular place. Belonging is then not anymore defined by human and non-human, but has shifted to include more than one species. The creatures that dwell with gardeners in these green spaces, like the soil and also the rain, for example, are not just materials to be used or species to be conserved. Rather, gardeners forge alliances with plants, with bacteria, with fungi and animals to contest the shape of the environment that surrounds them and to propose local and alternative solutions and lifestyle. And I would say that's particular in urban spaces. So speaking in Donna Haraway's words, in gardens, the line between human and more than human beings is reduced to a very faint trace and breaches the boundary between nature and culture. Gardening, in the sense, is then both nature and culture. As David Young wrote in his book, Philosophy in the Garden, these relationships between people and the more than human environment bridge the Cartesian divide and build gardens as spaces where the more than human is regularly transformed by humans without actually hiding the human and non-human processes that are necessary to create and sustain it. So he takes this example of plants and stones still being plants and stones, but then obviously they've been changed, they have been arranged in a sort of way, and they have been cultivated. And then if we contrast these lived experiences, of gardeners, what my interview partners then said is the problem is that social workers are often unable to understand the connection that people have to things that are not human. But they also stated how important it actually would be to becoming a less bureaucratic and mechanistic profession if we would just take into account these connections that are actually so important to people.
Verena, I'm just giving you your 5-minute mark.
Cool, thank you. So how can we now use these observations and experiences to describe a different and less anthropocentric understanding of community? To better understand what including the modern human beings into our communities actually might entail, I follow Bruce Morito's distinction between thinking about ecology and thinking ecologically. He argues, and I quote, "When we begin to think ecologically, we begin to understand ourselves, perceive, judge, and assume responsibilities differently. The underlying thought process is fundamentally different from that of the now present dominant mode of thought," end quote. Thinking ecologically in this context then involves shifting social work's perception of the modern human environment and abandon the capitalist perspective of a very much one-dimensional and rationalized nature, whose only purpose is to fulfill human needs and wants. The engagement with modern human beings is supposed to go beyond noticing them only when they are or have a problem, when they disturb us or when they become dangerous, like for example, species that are on the verge of extinction, or a very up-to-date example, bats transmitting the coronavirus. So treating any environmental problem not as a technological and financial challenge, but as a worldview issue, as Morito puts it, can be helpful to better understand the origin of these problems. Including ecological elements into social work's understanding of community breaks down with the modernist assumption of a of a strictly material character of nature, and denormalizes worldviews that are based on the exploitation of human and modern human beings alike. What is in a community's best interest and in social work's client's best interest is then newly determined. Oops, sorry. Oh, I'm missing a slide. Never mind. As a second step, social work then needs to find its own place in multi-species communities. So history teaches us that following human needs and even worse wants exclusively will in the long term lead to the destruction of planet Earth as we know it. Hence, community social work needs to adapt an alternative worldview and begin to think ecologically. In determining significance of interests and the legitimacy of resistance or approval, social work needs to support the community between all beings, not only humans. Gardens are a very tangible example to illustrate that all human activity does not happen in a vacuum, but is, as Stephen Hobson describes it, pursued within, together with, and with impacts on non-human nature. Multi-species communities, community social work requires what Donna Haraway calls ongoingness, that is, inventing and nurturing ways of living well with each other on our planet. While Haraway focuses her attention mainly on animals such as dogs or spiders or butterflies, forming ways of ongoingness, ways of co-creating space and place with all living creatures, that includes, for example, plants, is equally important. A garden is not only created by gardeners, but is also claimed by fungi, invaded by countless animals, and transformed by plants. It's flooded by rain, for example. All these ways of interacting in a particular place make evident the constant co-constitution of a particular place. And this then becomes very tangible in community gardens, but we can also observe it in any aspect of human life. In fact, I would argue that without these forms of co-creating space, there is no human life, and claims without social and ecological justice become obsolete. Acknowledging the status quo, the mistakes social work has made in the past, is a precondition for change. And I think we have heard that again previously today. In Haraway's words, staying with the trouble is never easy and is never innocent. It requires that we don't deny the ways in which social work always was and is unavoidably involved in violences. Ecologically conscious professionals must then acknowledge these pasts if they want to make changes to the present and the future. One of my interview partners pointed out how denying an ecological element in social work is pointless since, and I quote again, all of the social and human aspects of our work, of what we do, are already and will continue to be shaped by ecological considerations, end quote. So they already produce the social problems, as we often call it, that we are dealing with. Valuable community social work is therefore not a radical way to rethink social work's understanding of communities. Rather, I would say it is a way to fulfill the promises that social work made and keeps on making to its clients about social justice and about a better future. Thank you so much for being here today. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, that this is based on my master's dissertation from last year, and I will continue working on this in my PhD. So if you have any hints or recommendations or just any feedback, I look forward to hearing that in the Q&A or in any message. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Verena. Next up, we have Zean, Tara, Danielle, and Kimberly. We'll switch over the view. Zean, lovely to see you.
Hello. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for an engaging conversation, Verena. I am going to quickly introduce my team members who are being spotlighted as I speak, which is fantastic. And then we are going to go over our project, and then we're going to have you all engage in a exercise with us. So that it'll be a pretty interactive experience. So I'm going to put a link in the chat once we're done with the description, and we're going to work together on this exercise, and then we'll do a debrief. So first I'll start by introducing my team. So if everyone could quickly just say your name and your role in the project. So I'm going to have Tara start.
My name is Tara. I am an MSW and I'm working as a research assistant with this team.
And then Kim.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Bender. I use she and her pronouns, and I was one of the co-PIs in starting this project.
And Danielle, and then I'm going to have Danielle do our project description.
Yes, I'm Danielle Littman. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm a PhD student at University of Dunbar in Colorado, United States, as all of us are from that area, and I am a co-PI as well on this project. So before we jump into introducing our project, I'm going to offer a little bit of context for what we're going to be talking about. So we'll be using the phrase mutual aid a lot, and that's a term that, at least in our neck of the woods, has been very highly popularized within the last year, and so I thought it would be helpful first to start off with some definitions. So the definition that we're using when we talk about this work is from the mutual aid scholar and activist Dean Spade. And Dean Spade describes mutual aid as caring for one another by building new social relations that are more survivable than those unavailable by formal government supports. And so this often includes supporting folks in meeting basic needs, but also a reimagining of the social fabric where we really see ourselves in solidarity with one another, and meeting someone's needs as meeting our collective needs. And mutual aid has been a long-standing practice among communities who've experienced short-term crises such as natural and man-made disasters, as well as long-term crises like systemic marginalization and poverty. But it's also proliferated as a widespread practice during the COVID-19 pandemic and other compounding crises over the past year or two, as a way for individuals and communities to share resources when government and non-governmental services have fallen short. And so we've seen mutual aid in the past year or so being used to describe interventions where the state or government has fallen short, such as during the COVID-19 pandemic. In our state of Colorado, there have been a lot of wildfires, and we've seen mutual aid efforts really pop up, as well as racial justice protests. And so mutual aid as an idea and as a terminology and a practice has been proliferating in this time when people are coming to terms with the way that government has failed so many people, both in the past and is continuing to fail people. Mutual aid also refers to the long-term sustained care, the ways that individuals have supported one another when they're being systemically marginalized by governments. And mutual aid often also helps us imagine a future where care reigns over profit, capitalism, and traditional social services. And so we're going to be thinking a little bit together about this future with all of you today. And I'll pass it to Kim to describe our research.
Sure, I'll be brief. We're happy to answer more questions afterwards if there are. We, last summer and the early months of the pandemic, we became really interested in this proliferation of mutual aid, and some on our team had been involved in mutual aid for quite some time, and some of us were quite new to it. And we really began actually with a big media scan to sort of look at how is the media talking about mutual aid during this time. And based on some of the patterns that we saw in the media, we developed a semi-structured interview guide and interviewed 25 mutual aid facilitators and organizers across our state of Colorado. And that included, small towns in the mountains that are pretty isolated, and then big urban areas closer to Denver. And we kind of asked 4 main areas of questions. One is sort of how were folks conceptualizing mutual aid during the COVID pandemic? A second was what values or beliefs or ethics were underlying their mutual aid practices during this time. A third was what are sort of the benefits or byproducts that participants are seeing in their mutual aid work. And then the last was asking participants to sort of envision or imagine a future of mutual aid practices more broadly. And so what we're going to share with you today are some examples of what folks had to say about that last piece around the futures of mutual aid.
That's great. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to create an exercise to consider 3 potential futures that our participants had identified. So we're still analyzing and coming to theming around around this question, but we wanted to have folks really engage around thinking about what are the futures of mutual aid and how, if at all, social work fits in this future. So we were thinking social workers could see themselves as collaborators, as advocates, as abolitionists, and then thinking about it in relation to some of the conversations we had earlier in block 2, for example, thinking about the ways that uncertainty through climate crisis, through austerity and neoliberalism, how that impacts the ways that we as social workers, but also we as individuals in the world interact. So I'm going to have you all a Jamboard with us. And I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go through this process together. So the stakes are low. Do not be afraid. We're going to make this fun and engaging, and we have very little time, so don't worry if it's perfect. So what we're going to do is our participants provided a number of futures, right? We want you to consider the role of social work in these futures. How, if at all, and should social work engage? You as social workers can decide that. So we want your thoughts, your ideas, and questions. I'm going to go through each Jamboard one at a time, and we're going to have 90 seconds. So these are the 3 possible futures here. One of government being in charge of mutual aid as a companion or lubricant to the engine of government. The second one as a hybrid model where mutual aid is incentivized or sort of legitimized through different structures. And then the third one being mutual aid as the solution. So if you have not used Jamboard, I'm going to do a quick tutorial. On the left side, you can have a pen, so you can write in things. You can also erase, as you can see. You can add sticky notes, so you type here, and then press save, and it'll pop up and you can move it around with your cursor. There's also the option of adding an image using Google search. As you can see, I looked up add picture earlier. Finally, you can, I've never used circle, but you can circle things. And then you can, of course, add text. So you can insert text using a text box. Since this is a group project, please be mindful of other people in the space, and feel free to move things around. So before we get started, I'm going to stop sharing. Does anyone have any questions about the Jamboard? Feel free to raise your hand. Okay, so we're going to take 90 seconds and go through the 3 possible futures, and we will start with future 1. So if everyone can slide over to the second page, and this one is imagining government in charge, so mutual aid along. Feel free to read the quote that that the participant noted, and then we're just going to ask you to answer the question, how does and should social work fit into this particular future? So 90 seconds starting now. And if you would like, you can also add things to the chat and I can copy and paste them in if you do not have the ability to type things up. All right, we have about 30 seconds left. All right. We can, as we go along, you can always return to this page. So now we're going to move on to the second one, which is more of the hybrid model. So thinking about mutual aid as part of this ground up approach that's incentivized. So thinking about material incentives, institutional incentives, ways of engaging through social capital. So thinking about mutual aid being a way of responding during crises and as an emergent effort, in addition to having some more long-term, more long-term efforts. So we're gonna do 30 seconds again, or 90 seconds again. And feel free to use the quote as kind of a guiding. All right, let's get started.
Zean and colleagues, you have
Yeah.
a little bit under 5 minutes left.
Perfect. And I love that as more questions than answers seem to be the case for this one. So this is great. All right, we have about 20 seconds left in this one. All right. And so our final one, please feel free to add as we move along. I know it's very quick. And so our final future is one where mutual aid is the solution to meeting community needs. So that means that the assumption is that government is always going to fall short, right? And that the people will respond and do the work to care for each other. So again, we're going to use the quote as a guide, but we have very little time, so 90 seconds. All right, we have about 20 seconds. All right. I know this was very quick, so I'm going to do a little just fast summarizing, and we can have folks engage with this later. So the first one, thinking about government in charge and mutual aid alongside. So it's saying that a lot of folks are saying that, you know, this is business as usual. This is what we have right now. And thinking about social work role as being a little bit more reflexive and developing new tools where mutual aid can step in, where traditional social work can fall short. So we're going to move on quickly to thinking about this hybrid model. And I think a lot of folks have questions. We do too, right? And so let's see some questions of who decides who's responsible. Can we imagine incentive structures? How do we decide who gets incentivized, who gets cared for? And then thinking about the who controls the incentives. And then finally for this one, thinking about who gets included in this community, right? The challenges of who, like the state and how solutions get shared, and then thinking about will social work have to move out of the way? So I'm going to let my team hop in. I'm going to stop sharing. Does anyone on the team want to add any pieces? I know we have like less than a minute, so hop in if anybody sees anything to add.
Just reiterating that there are a lot more questions than answers, and I could also tell what futures sort of like brought up feelings for people, which I'm hoping we can continue the discussion more of in our discussion section after the next presentation.
Yeah, I would just add that in our team's discussions of these, they're sticky issues because social work's such a broad and diverse field. And so we had a lot of conversation about how to talk about mutual aid and social work and how they intersect is complex because of the diversity of social work and the way it can look. So we really invite conversation if folks see aspects of social work that could align better with a more collective community care sort of model of the future.
And I will say the last piece is that we spent a lot of time working through this presentation, and it really was a intensely collaborative process. And we had to challenge ourselves to think about, the fact that mutual aid is a practice that has existed long before we started doing this research. It will continue to exist and into the future. And we wanted to think about, how do we engage? How do we either connect to it, divest from it, intersect as social workers? And then we wanted to leave you with the question of where do you see yourself in these futures? And thinking about what are the ways that you choose to or not step into a future, one of the three futures that our participants have identified, or how do we avoid it so that we can have a more sort of pluralistic, more open, less humanistic, human focused future. So that's where I'll leave you.
Thank you very much. We're going to switch over to Zean now. Zean, you will have, or sorry, not Zean. Gosh, I'm the worst. Sorry, it's been a little bit long, and I'm terrible with names.
You're great.
but it's actually Blake. Blake, come on in.
Hello.
There we go. Hello.
Hi, hi, hi. Okay, let me just get my presentation going here, and I shall share my screen. Oh, will you enable me to share my screen?
What? No.
I don't think I'm a co-host quite yet.
Oh no. Heather, do you have the functionality, or is that me? Sorry, Blake.
That's quite all right.
It's you, Tina, because
it's you, Tina. Yeah.
Nah, shoot. No, it's whoever pinned Blake. Can you unpin Blake? Because there we go. I need my three little dots. My three little dots went missing, and now my three little dots have allowed me to make you a co-host. You're good to go, Blake. You should be able to share now.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, just do this and okay. Are we seeing my presentation?
Yes.
Okay,
Fantastic.
awesome.
You're good to go.
Wonderful. Let me just move this. All right. So hello, my name is Blake. Thank you for having me. It's truly an honor to be with you all today. And I'm going to be discussing my master's research project I completed for the MSW program at California State University, Chico. And that's entitled Exploring Disaster Case Managers' Perceptions of Solastalgia and the Long-Term Recovery of the Campfire. I would like to start by acknowledging that Chico State stands on the ancestral lands of the Mechoopda people who stewarded the lands and the water that runs through campus for centuries. My intention for our time together today is to introduce my work and hopefully receive feedback on how to move this work forward in my community and beyond. I also hope to engage in a critical discussion that moves past the theoretical and into the actionable of how social work can evolve to meet the challenges of our time. I would like to begin with an excerpt written by an anonymous campfire survivor that I feel really cuts to the heart of my research. Missing the smell of pines over a cup of coffee. I miss driving on tree-lined roads and watching as the sun plays peekaboo through the branches. I miss townfolk complaining about the skyway and the roads, traffic, and slow drivers. I missed the schoolyard. I would sit waiting for our baby boy to be walked out to the car and seeing the leaves fall from limbs heavy with the colorful foliage. I missed the winding roads when wet with rain and the dotted porch lights glimmering on the blacktop. I missed the seclusion in the trees and the warmth they gave me. I miss the smell of wood burning in the fireplace and watching as the fire crackles in its safe space. There are so many things I miss about being home. These are just a few that popped into my head this evening. I want to go home, but it isn't the same, nor will it be. We are miles away now, trying to build our lives in the same image of what we had. I hope and pray we can emotionally get back to where we were and the feeling of warmth and comfort when we walk into our new front door. They say grief is a process, and I'm ready for it to be over. On November 8th, 2018, the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California history broke out just 7 miles northeast of the town of Paradise in Northern California. The campfire at its fastest burned an equivalent of 1 football field per second. In only a matter of hours, the fire destroyed most of the town of Paradise and displaced over 30,000 people. The campfire claimed the lives of 86 individuals, burned over 150,000 acres, an area that approximately the size of Chicago, and destroyed nearly 14,000 homes. After the campfire, there was a profound sense of loss and grief that reverberated throughout my county. However, the emotional pain and grief that I kept hearing about, which really resonated with me, was more than the loss of homes or belongings. People were mourning the loss of the trees, the landscape, and the wildlife. People had felt a deep connection and love for the areas affected by the campfire, and what was once covered in dense, beautiful forest was now a barren and unrecognizable landscape. And so what the research is telling us, shouting at us really, is that climate change will continue to increase the incidence and ferocity of wildfires in California, and human populations will continue to be exposed to devastating societal loss, ecological loss, and environmental degradation. There's also a growing concern about the associated adverse impacts on human health and well-being. And research from around the globe has begun to show that after severe environmental degradation, like that seen in the aftermath of a catastrophic wildfire, people mourn the loss of cherished and home environments, a grief that I myself was experiencing and was hearing about from countless others. And that's when I discovered the concept of solastalgia. Solastalgia is a neologism created by the environmental philosopher Glenn Albrecht, and the word can be broken down into solace, meaning comfort, consolation, desolation, meaning devastation, abandonment, and loneliness, and algia, which means pain or distress. You might notice that solastalgia is very similar to a word we do know, nostalgia. This was a purposeful decision by Albrecht because he wanted solastalgia to be structurally similar to nostalgia in order to embed the meaning of place and home within the word. So essentially, when you put it all together, solastalgia means the pain and loss of solace you feel when your beloved place or home environment is desolated beyond recognition. It is the mental, emotional, and spiritual impacts of environmental degradation. Albrecht coined this term after open-cut coal mining had turned his home in New South Wales in Australia, an area once considered the Tuscany of the South, to what residents later described as a lunar landscape. Early studies led to the development of the Environmental Distress Scale, or the EDS, which measures the biopsychosocial costs of environmental disturbances. The EDS was also able to successfully validate and measure the concept of solastalgia. So now the EDS and solastalgia have been applied and measured in communities, ecosystems, and landscapes across the globe. From Indonesia following the Mount Merapi volcanic eruption, in Canada after the McClure fire, after severe drought in Ghana following Hurricane Katrina, and with Inuit populations in Canada. So because place is embedded in the meaning of solastalgia, this research is also informed by sense of place theory. This theory describes the complex emotive bonds and attachments that people develop with place as a product of social and biophysical interaction, and it attempts to explain how people make meaning of, attach to, depend on, and identify with place. While sense of place is unique to every individual, variations are patterned and lead to systematic differences in attachment, meanings, and behavior. I believe a robust understanding of sense of place could help illuminate people's relationship to the natural environment, explain and predict behavior in response to environmental change, and examine community resilience. So I wanted to apply the concept of solastalgia and sense of place to the long-term recovery of the campfire. And so during my concentration year of my MSW program, I interned as a disaster case manager with campfire survivors. I decided to study whether or not other DCMs, disaster case managers, were noticing solastalgia, experiencing solastalgia themselves, and what their current level of awareness and understanding was of the importance of people-place relationships. So my research question was, how does working with campfire survivors impact DCMs, disaster case managers, understanding of solastalgia and the importance of people's connection to place? To answer this question, I utilized a mixed method longitudinal research design. My pre and post test surveys borrowed relevant components of Higginbotham's environmental distress scale. I also conducted 2 focus groups to create a dialogue surrounding DCMs and their clients' experience of solastalgia, how working with survivors had impacted DCMs personally, and how it had impacted their understanding of people-place relationships. And finally, what could be done to rebuild people's connection to place and alleviate solastalgia. The quantitative findings demonstrated that after working with survivors, DCMs became more aware and distressed over how the campfire had impacted the area, and DCMs also gained an increased awareness of solastalgia and sense of place. For DCMs who resided in Butte County during the fire or who were fire survivors themselves, it appears that Disaster Case Management Service actually lowered their solastalgia levels. The qualitative data seems to indicate that for folks directly affected by the campfire, service to other survivors has the potential to heal solastalgia. Another interesting finding was the complete absence of correlations between DCMs and how they rated their clients' place attachment, impact, and solastalgia from the pre to post test. I believe this finding underscores the highly variable and subjective experience of each client system, and the lack of correlations was at least partially due to the highly subjective and unique nature of trauma, grief, sense of place, and disaster recovery. So for my qualitative results, all of the DCMs who participated in the focus groups were able to recall instances where their clients expressed statements of solastalgia. So statements like missing the wildlife running through their backyard. Also, they reported clients struggled to accept the negative transformation, which left them feeling unsettled and empty, some describing the change as surreal. Several DCMs mentioned clients' difficulty in expressing their grief over the environment, alluding to solastalgia as a form of disenfranchised grief or ambiguous loss. DCMs articulated that for campfire survivors, community did not just mean their social relationships, but had a much broader definition and encompassed the landscape, wildlife, and plant life. Within the theme of coping and healing, DCMs, those who were campfire survivors themselves, mentioned that signs of vegetation growth and the burn scar acted as a symbol of hope and the possibility for their own personal recovery. Also, DCMs talked about how their service working with survivors had been pivotal in their own healing and recovery journey and has enhanced feelings of connection to their community and to their environment. They also speculated that service in the form of community programs and reforestation efforts could also be healing for their clients as well. So within these themes that were revealed in the qualitative data analysis, they're interconnected and overlapping. And within the overlap of my major themes, I was able to identify my sub-themes. So trauma attached to place was a sub-theme of trauma, but it also intersected with sense of place theory because survivors' place meanings had changed. As one DCM stated, for my client, paradise now means fear and trauma. This new place meaning significantly impacted survivors' place attachments and place identities. DCMs reported that clients' experiences were highly variable and unique, which correlates with those quantitative findings. They said that some clients really dug in and wanted to stay and rebuild, while other clients wanted to leave and never look back. DCMs described clients' forced displacement from their home as losing their root system. Other clients were able to relocate to similar environments and communities, and DCMs described those clients as better adjusted. And still, other clients were forced to relocate to areas drastically different than their home environments because it was simply what they could afford. And DCMs described those clients as unhappy and longing for their home environments. So throughout these conversations, DCMs portrayed the inextricable nature of the issues campfire survivors faced, and they found it impossible to discuss solastalgia without mentioning the loss of community. A conversation about survivors' place attachments inevitably led to a discussion of trauma, grief, and loss. And I think that speaks to the fact that life and human experience are more than a summation of their separate parts and are more like a web or a tapestry. If one thread is cut, the fabric unravels behind it. So moving forward, sadly for communities in the wildland-urban interface in California, wildfire is no longer an if, but a when. On August 17th of 2020, the North Complex fire sparked and threatened the areas already impacted by the campfire. The North Complex fire decimated the town of Berry Creek and endangered the town of Oroville. While the North Complex fire was less deadly than the Camp Fire, it burned over 300,000 acres, an area more than double the size of the burn scar caused by the Camp Fire. And furthermore, climate change will continue to cause environmental degradation and ecosystem loss and create more experience of solastalgia. Solastalgia causes existential discomfort, and without proper support and processing can paralyze individuals in grief, depression, anxiety, and isolation. I believe an understanding of solastalgia can inform public health planning, disaster recovery, social work, and even land management to improve community resilience and outcomes. Currently in my work, I'm partnering with community agencies and disaster recovery services, and I'm in the process of trying to find ways to incorporate the Solastalgia Index into client needs assessments and DCM training. I also think situating solastalgia as a form of disenfranchised grief could potentially illuminate interventions and practices. Also, the act of naming and grieving produces opportunities for communities to come to terms with the loss, find connection with each other, and promote collective action. Right now, I'm also, I just finished, I'm a certified forest therapy guide with the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy, and I will begin to provide nature-based therapy with campfire survivors and conduct research on its efficacy. This research will also include the Solastalgia Index. I believe forest therapy or forest bathing, which you might know it by, shows a lot of promise in helping people process trauma, grief, and rebuild connections to place and nature or the more than human world and each other. There's also evidence that suggests that regreening or reforestation activities are crucial aspects to reorient survivors to their home environments and could aid in the post-disaster rebuilding of social connections, social capital, positive place attachments, but also support environmental recovery and repair broken or traumatic relationships with the land. So what social work does the world need now is beautifully articulated by the DCMs. Community must be expanded beyond anthropocentrism. I believe to shift that paradigm, we need inclusive language and to radically change how we conceptualize and relate with other beings. The rights of nature movement shows a lot of promise in this work. Also, environmental mourning requires expanding our frameworks away from the individual patient-focused structures to encompass ideas of larger social and environmental consciousness. Social and environmental justice must be centered within social work education, not just as a class or an elective. And personally, I believe social workers must be agents of social change and be more radical in our approaches and work to deconstruct the buffer zone. I also believe we must begin to tear down the ivory tower of academia and not only honor, but value different ways of knowing, especially from Indigenous and BIPOC perspectives. We must elevate traditional ecological knowledge and lift up those communities to positions of power and leadership across disciplines. Some questions I'm still struggling with are, what does multi-inter-transdisciplinary approach to forest and fire management and climate resiliency, which includes social work, what does that actually look like? What role can social work play in climate preparation, mitigation, and recovery? And how can we elevate and validate the field of social work to pull up a chair to the table of the climate change conversation? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Blake. That was a fantastic wrap up and bridge into a discussion. Okay, my brain is bouncing all over the place because you folks are super, super duper interesting. What do folks think? How would we like to start our discussion? We have about 25 minutes before we have to break for a break. So if folks want to throw comments into the chat, you can absolutely do that. Or if anyone wants to raise a hand, if there's a million hands, I'll moderate the hands. But if there's just one or two, then folks can just jump in and start chatting and getting super duper nerdy about stuff they care about, because that would be cool too. I'm going to be quiet and see who starts talking first.
I will go ahead and jump in. Blake, my head is just spinning after your presentation in the best kind of way, because I also feel like our presentations are like very interconnected and talking to one another. So I guess one of the questions that I'm thinking about is how mutual aid might serve as kind of a buffer against solastalgia, and I recognize the limited nature of that, given that mutual aid's focus tends to be more on people and less on place. And so what would it look like to create sort of mutual aid networks or systems of healing with one another that allow for the place piece to come into the equation as well? So that's one of my questions that's coming out of it, but I'm curious to know what's sparked for other folks as well.
Just to quickly respond to that, I think what I've seen mutually, and I mentioned that I was a part of a mutual aid group directly following the campfire. And a lot of that looked like, driving people. I mean, the months that followed that disaster were chaotic is an understatement. And so it looked like just meeting immediate needs for quite a while. But then some other interesting things began to happen with local environmental groups and park managers and more environmentally focused groups of doing like tree replanting in the burn scar. And none of that really gained a lot of traction in the social work or mutual aid field. It does really tend to be focused on social relationships. But what I saw in those tree plantings that I did attend was this really, really beautiful healing moment of going into that land with other human beings. And so I think that for me, when I think about mutual aid, when I think about I think that healing is a parallel, like spiraling process, that we must heal the land in order to heal ourselves, and we must heal ourselves in order to heal the land. So I could ramble on for a while, but I'll stop there and just say that I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's a good one.
Donna, go ahead.
Okay. Only commenting because in earlier sessions today, I had these visions of, I lived briefly in Australia, and when they had those kind of huge bushfires and everything had gone, but things would still grow, you'd still see life there. And we're looking, I think, in England at the end of social work as we know it. And it's this kind of like, maybe almost you have to let it go to regenerate. And so I was really struck by what is the environment that is then in those social relationships. I think there's so much from the talks today that we can look at in different ways. So I just wanted to comment on that because it was the vision I had from this afternoon session that you brought to life because of that there. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Donna. Does anyone want to respond to that, or should we go to Walter? You guys get to make the call. Revisioning all of social work for all time. Okay. Walter, do you want to go ahead?
Well, just a comment that struck me in relation to a theme that's weaving through the whole conference, which is the relation to the COVID corona crisis, where in a way, what you describe, the relationship to the environment and to concrete places, whilst being very painful, is a reference point. And I'm just wondering how you can relate your findings to trauma that in a way is dislocated. I mean, I'm thinking particularly also of work with refugees where this, I don't call it nostalgia, but this attachment to a home place is sometimes a very deceptive reference point that cannot be realized, even though it's very difficult in an environmental context like you describe. But the letting go is in a way more complicated when there isn't a physical framework to it. And I'm thinking of this element of moving on, which I detect is rated in the current corona crisis, where people also long for a sense of community that needs to be restructured rather than, returned back to in the old normality.
I just want to quickly respond to that, Walter, because I really love that point. And, thinking about the area that was affected by the campfire, that area is not how that area is supposed to look. What people were attached to was historical practice of like gold rush era logging and clearing. And that's a big reason that it burns so catastrophically. But so they have this place attachment to a place that's not actually what it's meant to be environmentally and ecologically. So I think that's a very interesting discussion. And I think, part of the regreening of spaces and then applying that to refugees about how do we, because place attachment is so pivotal in mental and community health, how do we help people build new attachments that are healthy and strong and attached to community and community that expands past social relationships into the more than human world. So I appreciate that.
Can I just also comment on that? I find this very interesting, this narrative about crisis, because crisis very often what we see in practice is that that's the point where things start to change, like the COVID crisis, for example, or when there's wildfires, or I've been in Mexico a few years ago and we had earthquakes there, and it was also like a breaking point and where people started new at some point. But then at the same time, when we look at like bigger crisis, like the climate crisis, for example, the crisis narrative does not seem to work in the same way in kind of communicating a crisis, I feel. So there it's more, it kind of destroys almost the engagement that people have because it's so ongoing and it seems to be so long. That crisis is no longer a valid explanation or justification for change. And that's not just, it's just a comment on crisis in general. I think it's very interesting.
Zean, were you going to say something, or can I open it up to more questions or comments from the floor?
No, I was just affirming what both folks have said. And I think that idea around one of the things that we're noticing in our data is that a few participants have noted that we're never not in a crisis, right? Like we are currently experiencing like multiple crises at the same time that are sort of that are resulting in a lot of like seismic responses, but they're all short term as opposed to thinking about the longevity of what is happening in our time and how do we respond to these things when it feels like you get whiplash basically from responding so quickly to all of the things that are happening concurrently.
Thank you. Joel, you want to go ahead, and then Heather after Joel?
Hey, can you all hear me? Yeah, I go by he, him for my pronouns. Thinking about crisis too, just going off Verena's and Zean talking about this, like the crisis of everyday life too, right? Like people have been in crises before, climate change, and all these ecological and social macro crises, right? Like building up. I mean, people have crises every day, right? That we don't hear about, have led to like mutual aid going mainstream. Mutual aid being labeled as basically activists running errands for people. I've been doing mutual aid work for like 10 years. And coming out of like anarchist circles, it's for me personally, I have a lot of issues with like Dean Spade's work and Dean Spade's definitions of mutual aid, and how it's centered in like whiteness and European anarchism and a lot of those strains. But I do think it is an opportunity, and I've written about this in a good bit of my scholarship so far, is reimagining social work as mutual aid, because it does have linkages to the past, as if we start thinking about social work as like arts, right? Like artists have a profession, right? Rethinking a profession as you know, what you do with your time, and not necessarily like, you know, credentialism and healthism and psychopathology and all these kinds of things. And it leads us more to thinking about community, right? Like community work. I choose to call myself a community worker here in the United States because I don't want people to think I'm a therapist when I tell them, you know, that I'm a social worker, right? Because there's those associations, and that's not to devalue what that is, but I've been starting to think more and more about this idea of direct action, right? Like taking direct action with things, and direct services as direct action, right? So like thinking of social services as community organizing, right? The traditional feminist model of like Verena, like your community gardens, right, are a form of organizing. They're a form of community organizing, and they're a feminist practice because they're not pressuring structures of power to change and, you know, trying to run for office and these kinds of things. They're building alternative institutions out of state structures. So to me, that's what mutual aid can look like if we're starting to rethink about social work, and that can link to new forms of eco-social thinking in terms of like globalization, right? Like think locally, act globally kind of thing, and linking these transnational and sort of interdisciplinary trains of thought. Hopefully some of you are following me here. I'm rambling and I'm taking up too much time, but I just wanted to make a comment there. And with respect to that, and again, mutual aid is definitely like a touchy subject for me, because when I hear people talk about it, I jump in. It's like, oh, this is great. I'm so happy to see people talking about mutual aid now, but it's definitely, I feel like been de-radicalized, and definitely I'm glad it's being discussed because it's being reinterpreted away from whiteness as well, that it comes out of the anarchist circles. So thank you all, really great presentations. I will be quiet now.
Thank you, Joel. Heather, you want to go ahead? Oh, unless Zean, was that was a
yeah, I just want to say one thing to Joel. I think part of the challenge, right, with radical education for people is getting people to that point. And I think one of the things that's really helpful in thinking about the ways that mutual aid is being conceptualized and framed currently is that a lot of people are depoliticized. And I will say a lot of people, and I mostly mean people who are enfranchised in places like the United States, where they feel like they don't have stakes, right? Like they're not, they're enfranchised, so they feel like they are going to be cared for. And I think one of the things that the ways that we are thinking about mutual aid currently is doing is like proving to people that care is conditional in our world, right? And that if you are disenfranchised, you become part of this larger pool of like, you are uncared for. And so how do we open the network of who becomes part of our care networks? What does that look like? And how does that like move people towards a more radical imagination? So that's kind of where, I mean, I also have problems with the ways it's being framed, but I think it's really useful to think about it as a long game. So that's where I'm.
Thank you. Heather, you want to jump in?
Just a comment. Thank you so much for your presentations. They were all really interesting and engaging and thought-provoking. I suppose one of the things I was thinking, I'm just interested in your own knowledge practices, Verena's images, and you guys using Jamboard, and this connection with maps and images that you had, Blake. And one of the things that has been discussed by a number of contributors is about how do we move beyond sort of dominant Western ways of knowing and ways of sharing or meaning making with each other. And I just was struck by the way that you guys are exploring those and trying to not say we're going to do this, but doing it in the way that you communicate. And I think that was really refreshing and good to see more of it. And so in addition to that, I was thinking, and I don't know if you've come across Danielle Kellermeyer's book on summertime. She writes about the Australian fire, where she writes effectively it's she's a philosopher, but it's a piece of creative writing on the death of our pig in the fire. And I just thought it kind of had resonance when you were talking about your experience, thinking about how do you how do you discuss this stuff? It's, you know, it's too, it's so complex and it's so multi-sensorial, and how do you communicate it in ways that honours that? And then, yeah, so thank you for that. Really appreciate it.
Would you mind putting that name in the chat, Heather? I'd love to look that up.
I've put a wee link in there as well. I think it's further back.
Oh, beautiful.
There we go. Yeah, I think you'll love it.
Yes, I attended a wildfire resiliency summit last month, and I was the only social worker there. And it was really frustrating because well, for so many reasons, but also the next day, serendipitously, we had an individual from the Mechoopda tribe come and talk to our forest therapy training group, and they just got a big land grant for their new reservation, and they're going to be repairing areas, doing a lot of like cool ecological restoration, and then on their old land that they were given back, but they can't do prescribed burns because they're not fire bosses and they don't have the federal certification, and it's their own land and they can't even manage it the way that it should be managed because of all of these permits and requirements. And I asked, like, how can I support like TEK, like traditional ecological knowledge? And everyone's just like, well, you can't. Like, what does that mean? Surely we can't, but there's so many. So it's like blind environmentalism also can be just as harmful as not, right? So just seeing the other side of the coin of like clean air acts and laws that we have in California prevent people from doing prescribed burns, but then we have catastrophic wildfires that undo all of the clean energy we did that year. So what's the give and take with that, you know?
Thank you so much.
I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. Does anyone want to jump in with a last thought or a question for our fantastic presenters? Do the presenters want to poke at each other? Oh, I see a Verena hand. That was a Verena hand. Verena has something to say.
Verena, is just something more organizing thing. It would be great if people could pop all the resources and books and whatever they've been sharing in the Zoom chat, also on Discord, so that people who watch the recording later also have access to everything we've just been talking about. That's it.
Because I just want to echo Heather's comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
It feels like such a lovely space that you all have created in order to share these learnings. And one piece as we were preparing for this is that there's traditionally you step into these spaces and you have to have all the answers. And I think what felt really nice about this space is to bring questions and to think together and imagine together. So really appreciative of that environment. I think we need more of that in order to navigate the futures that are possible.